Today is March 31st, 2015. My name is Martin Frank, and I am in the Senior Physiologist Lounge in the Boston Convention Exposition Center, where I'm interviewing Jackie Wood, a fellow Illini who unfortunately is at the Ohio State University. Jackie has been there since 1985. He's been a member of the American Physiological Society since 1972. His research has focused on the electrical and synaptic behavior of the enteric neurons in the gastrointestinal tract, and he has been a major contributor to the science of GI physiology. Jackie, welcome to the Living History program, and thank you very much for the opportunity to interview for the program and talk a little bit about our common history at the U of I and where you ended up as opposed to what I've ended up doing.
Well, thanks for the opportunity to do an interview.
Jackie, why don't we start by having you tell us about your family upbringing and how you became interested in science?
Well, I grew up in a lead and zinc mining area in northeast Oklahoma. My grandparents were involved with an Eagle Pitcher mining company, and so that meant I had a paid scholarship to college. I went to a small high school in Commerce, Oklahoma. 50 seniors in my graduating class, so the math wasn't the greatest. I had one course in calculus. Commerce, Oklahoma, I should mention, aside from myself as a celebrity, the other major celebrity was a great New York Yankees outfielder named Mickey Mantle.
I think I've heard of him.
You've heard of Mickey Mantle,
yes.
in the same hometown. Well, graduating from high school, I had to go to college, and so 2 or 3 of my friends and I, we went over to the junior college in northeast Oklahoma, A&M. The idea was we would go there, pick up the math, and then go on down to Oklahoma State. But the dean, we went over to talk to the dean, and the dean said, well, boys, what would you like to do? What do you want to be? And we said, hell, we don't know. And he said, well, why don't you boys be engineers? So that's the way I began as an engineer. But, you know, engineering is not that far removed from physiology because engineers want to know how things work, or I did. I thought for engineering that would be attractive for me, and physiology is very much the same. Still, the mantra to medical students in my 40 years of teaching always is you must understand how the system works in order to understand what goes wrong with it, in order to make a diagnosis, and in order to strategy as how to treat the disorders. So.
Well, clearly, as a physiologist myself, I totally endorse what you have to say, and we can talk about it perhaps later about medical education and how it has changed in the context of the level of physiology that students are learning today. So let's keep that in mind as we get later in the interview. You received a bachelor's and master's degree from Kansas State University. How did you get interested in physiology? You said you went to a junior college first.
I went to a junior college, and then I went to the Brent campus of Kansas State, which was in Pittsburgh, Kansas, which was commuting distance, and there's some very good people. I took a course or 2 in plant physiology. The professor of physiology was a great guy, and I respect him a lot. I learned. I come to understand what physiology was all about, and in fact, his name was Leland Keller. He had had his PhD from the University of Kansas, and encouraged me to go to medical school, but instead I stayed and did a master's degree with him with an interest in simple nervous systems. In cockroaches, the little hair, those little cerci that detect hair movement. I was recording from the first synapse between those, and that's what piqued my interest in simple nervous systems, independent integrative nervous systems.
Right, and clearly your interest in nervous system took you to the University of Illinois.
Absolutely.
Which now makes you an Illini.
Yes, I'm very proud of that, in fact.
And so tell us a little bit about the research you did, and of course both you and I had experience with Lad Prossor, a great comparative and neurophysiologist, and let's talk a little bit about him as well.
Sure. Well, my reasons for going to the University of Illinois rather than deciding to go to medicine was Lad Prossor. And Lad Prossor had done his postdoctoral work in England at Cambridge with Adrian, was the person, and of course you know his textbook,
oh, yes.
Comparative Physiology. So that was that's what drew me to Illinois. And Lad accepted me as a student. And so things went, you know very well, the first year of physiology at Illinois is outstanding. There's no better program in the country than at that time. So Lad, you remember third floor Burrell Hall.
I do remember.
Lad we had his graduate students, we had offices there. We were all crowded in the office there. And Lad came into the office one afternoon, and he had 2 note cards. And those note cards were 2 papers from a Japanese guy named Yokoyama, who had tried to record from the neurons in the wall of the gut. So Lad came down and he showed me those. I couldn't read his writing, but,
right.
But he had those cards. It turned out the Japanese fella, I got to know him very well in later years, but he wasn't recording from the neurons, he was recording from the muscle cells.
Okay.
So Lad said, Jack, you know how to do all this kind of recording. I'd like for you to try to record from the neurons in the intestine. In those days, there was big arguments about whether there was electrical coupling between smooth muscle cells. In fact, you remember Nick Spralakis.
I remember Nick.
Nick and Lad were at odds because Nick didn't believe it. But what that meant was cats were being used, 2 or 3 cats a week. So I collected some small intestine when they euthanized a cat and prepared a little preparation, had my electrodes and everything. And the first time I touched an electrode down on an exposed enteric ganglion, I heard the neurons discharging.
Because we used to set them up with a microphone speaker system.
Yep, so you could hear the single unit discharge. And so those were the very first recordings from the neurons in the wall of the gut. Now we know them as enteric neurons, and I published the first paper on that in 1970. Respect to Lad, Lad is not on the first paper, for the first recordings from enteric.
Who was on it?
No, just
you.
I'm the only one. In these days of where senior authors, corresponding authors prefer to be recognized as being the last author, Lad felt it was better for me if I published the paper alone.
And you were still a graduate student?
I was still a graduate student, no, absolutely. So that first recording from enteric neurons and the first paper has held me in very good stead, because research is the way it is. You discover first thing, the next thing is the next question. The next question leads to the next question, and so that's led to me to discovering slow synaptic excitation for 5-hydroxytryptamine as a neurotransmitter for slow synaptic excitation. Then that eventually leads into the communication from immune inflammatory cells to the enteric neurons, and on and on. And I was trying to remember the year. I was the first one to call it a brain in the gut, a little brain in the gut. I think I did that in an annual review of physiology, in fact. And this is universally accepted now, because the mantra now, and it's a correct mantra, is that if the little brain in the gut is not working correctly, then there will be symptoms.
Right.
And without the enteric nervous system, the gut doesn't work at all.
Right.
And that's, for example, that's Hirschsprung's disease,
sure.
Terminal segment with, let's say, ganglionic.
Let's go back a little bit to Illinois, and I'm sure a lot of people who may watch this will have heard the name Lad Prossor. But talk a little bit about Lad and the type of person he was and the type of mentor he was.
Well, and just the fact that Lad didn't put his name on papers for me. He felt it was best for my career. So that tells you something about Lad Prossor. So another example of Lad in that respect is the very first paper I ever published was on the squid digestive tract and recording from neurons in the squid stomach. Well, the way I did that is Lad always went to Woods Hole on the Cape in the summertime. He had a cottage there, and so he took me with him one summer. And he shared a lab with B.C. Abbott. Remember Abbott?
BC, sure.
And so I worked in the lab, but I could do, Lad said, do whatever you want. You can get the supply, you can get whatever you want. So the squid giant axons were where this was the focus of attention at Woods Hole, which was a fantastic place. Woods Hole and the University of Illinois physiology had very much in common between the two places. So I dissected a squid stomach and got some electrodes and found very similar situation as in the vertebrate GI tract. Here are squid, they evolved from bivalves, clams and oysters and that sort of thing. So it was parallel evolution between vertebrates and squids evolving to become swimming pelagic carnivores. So the selective pressures must be very similar.
Right.
And so the guts were, the stomach and the intestine of the squid is so very similar. There were some little differences. For example, we use acetylcholine as an excitatory transmitter. The squid uses catecholamines, uses norepinephrine as the transmitter. But I published that. I talked to Ladd, and he encouraged me to write up a paper, and he reviewed it. And but he didn't want me to put his name on it. He said, "You did the work; it's your work." So that's another indication of Ladd Prossor. Everything Ladd did was related to something, and this was natural to Ladd to be this way. For example, when I took my first job was at Williams College. And the reason my first job was at Williams College is a physiologist there. His name was Sam Matthews. And Sam respected Ladd. He thought Ladd was the ultimate physiologist. So he got in touch with Ladd and said, "We want to hire, I'm stepping down, and we want to hire a good physiologist at Williams College." So Ladd comes back into the office and said, "Jack, you ought to go there. You ought to go look." And of course, they offered me the job. And then I went back to Ladd, and he said, "Take the job."
So how many years were you at Williams?
Just about 3.5.
And I think it's important to recognize that Williams is an outstanding undergraduate campus today.
Absolutely.
As it has been in the past. It's produced a number of outstanding APS members, physiologists as well.
You bet.
But it's a different environment. It's an undergraduate campus. Were you able to, you probably did a lot of teaching?
Well, not so very much. I had a course each semester, either general and comparative physiology or systems and organs physiology. But then we had time for the students. The difficulty, the outstanding students. And I have papers with some of the Williams students, and I still hear from them. The difficulty was, I got my first grant. I got an NSF grant my first year at Williams, again studying the enteric nervous system. But those guys, as good as they were, they always got into medical school.
Right.
So I would have them for maybe a year, and then they were off to medical school. So but the real motivation for leaving Williams was, do you remember E.B. Brown, when E.B. Brown was chair of physiology at the University of Kansas?
Yes, I do.
And E.B. came to one of my posters at the good old Federation meetings, which you remember very well.
In Atlantic City.
Did you remember going from the University of Illinois?
We would rent a van, and we would all get in the van and drive and stay at these seedy hotels.
Yep. Well, that earlier year at the Federation meeting, that's where all the GI was in those days, was someone had given a DC-8 4-engine prop plane at the University of Illinois.
I only got to do vans, so you...
No, this is a story in itself. The biochemist and the physiologist all went to the Federation meetings in that airplane. And so the airplane was parked in Atlantic City on the tarmac, but because they wanted to charge us to unload the luggage, we unloaded it ourselves. So they wouldn't care for the airplane. So we were climbing out of Atlantic City in this 4-engine DC-8, or what I think it was a DC-8, and the guy sitting next to the window said, "Hey, something's not quite right with that engine." It was winding down, and there was feathering the prop. So the pilot came on and said, "We're going to have to land. We'll land in Baltimore." So we landed, but the story, the gist of that story was, while the plane was parked on the tarmac, starling birds built nests in the throat of the carburetor. So every time you try to accelerate, the old engine would die down.
Well, I'm glad you guys landed and we're all
I'm
safe.
Still around, absolutely.
That's right. You moved from Williams to Kansas.
Yep.
Tell us a little bit about that move and how long you were there and things that occurred
Well,
in
that was the, I started to tell you about E.B. Brown.
Mm-hmm.
E.B. came around to my poster in Atlantic City and looked at the poster and talked to me a little bit and learned that I was from northeast Oklahoma, which is not that far from Lawrence, Kansas and Kansas City, and said, you know, we're recruiting for a physiologist, and you know, I'd like to invite you to come out, give us a talk. And so I did, and that's the story. I got the job at Kansas, and I stayed there. That was in 1971. They promoted me pretty fast to full professor, and so I didn't know whether I wanted to be the chair, but E.B. had stepped down. But the short of the story was that I was also getting other offers for chairs of physiology, and I became a little bit intrigued by the University of Nevada.
And that was a new school, wasn't it?
Yes, it had been a 2-year program. They had expanded it to a 4-year program, and they were recruiting chairs of the basic science departments and chairs of the clinical departments. So I went out to look, and you know, Reno was intriguing. I was single at the time, and you know, lots of excitement. Lake Tahoe, they always take you up there and they tell you about the skiing and that sort of thing. So the short of it is, in 1979, I moved to become the chair of physiology at the new medical school.
Who were some of the people you recruited to the new faculty?
Well, it was going to be a small faculty, obviously, so I tried to recruit people around my interest in GI physiology.
Okay.
So I recruited Helen Cook, took a job there. Rick Rogers took a job with us. Gerlinda Herman. Let me think of who else. Kent Sanders, who's done very well as the chair of physiology. All were at the University of Nevada. And then when I moved to Ohio State, I negotiated positions for everyone, and most of those moved with me to Ohio State when I went there as I moved there as the chair.
Before you go on, obviously I've watched lots of college football games and professional football games. It's not Ohio State, it's the Ohio State.
That is correct.
That is correct. Just to clarify.
And try sometimes when you write the Ohio State University, the add an extra Z. Marty, if you'll put an extra E on that V, that would be helpful.
That's a proper way.
That would be.
Tell us about Ohio State and the move there. Obviously, you went there. Emil Bosler had been chair of physiology there, and I believe you came in right after he retired, right?
Yeah. Emil, actually, Emil had already retired, but he was still working. He continued to work for years thereafter. The chair there was Heinz Pieper.
Okay.
Heinz Pieper, and he had retired and moved on to retire in Florida when I arrived, so I didn't deal with any ex-chairs.
Right.
And so it was this was a department with 24 full-time faculty, state-funded positions, which was very attractive for me because we built the program with, you know, indirect costs and
so the Reno program was indirect costs and NIH-funded salaries as opposed to hard money positions.
No, we had hard money positions at Reno also.
Okay. But Ohio State was hard money.
Hard money also.
Not anymore.
No, definitely not anymore. But there were many, you know, there were lots of senior physiologists in that department, and as the new chair, you know, I had to form relationships with these guys, and everything worked out very well as the move to Ohio State, and you know, I'm happy I made it. I was chair. I stepped down in 97.
Okay, so you were chair for about 12 years.
Yeah.
We mentioned Emil Bosler. I knew his work on muscle. Who were some of the other people who were in the department?
Well, besides Emil, there's Jack Rawl.
Right.
Jack Rawl, I see he's just published a Physiology books program. I see Jack has just
Thank
published.
you. That was the commercial break for the APS book that he wrote. Yeah.
Yeah, and Jack Boulant was a very good temperature control person. There was a guy, Bert Kuntz, who in temperature regulation also, but environmental aspects of temperature regulation. But the history of the department, when it was written not so long ago by a neurologist, a chief of neurology, it reads about me coming there and about how I was recruited because research was very light at that time. It was teaching-oriented department, to promote research, research at the level we now know it should be. It was in those days. You know, Marty, people like us, you know, when you become involved with the NIH, so I was doing lots of reviews, like site reviews and everything, and I could see what good programs were. And so how you had to pursue NIH money, you had to pursue NIH training grants, and that's what I tried to do at Ohio State, which did at the time wasn't as far along as some of the other departments. University of Illinois, for example.
University of Illinois was a phenomenal department, as we both know. The breadth of physiological knowledge and research and teaching that occurred there is probably unique, especially as you alluded to at Reno. You created a focused group around your general areas of research. In a lot of institutions, lots of departments, we see that today. Sure. It sounds like Ohio State was a much broader department in terms of range of expertise. You brought your group of GI, smooth muscle physiologists in, electrophysiologists, but there was still a breadth of physiological knowledge and expertise within the department.
Absolutely, especially in terms of teaching, because we had major teaching programs, nursing school, physical therapist, 2 undergraduate courses, so there was a lot of teaching. And we had our own had the PhD program at the time too, which eventually became, to my chagrin, integrated into a unified program of biomedical science or something of that nature.
Well, clearly your research program, which is focused on the enteric nervous system, had a really simple start, which, as you alluded to, was the recording in the cockroach.
Absolutely.
And it shows the unity across species of information, process, et cetera. What are your thoughts about how your research evolved from those early days to where it ultimately ended up?
Well, much of the evolution is once you discover neurotransmitters and neurotransmission, and you can describe it in terms of receptors and the neurotransmitters, then the pharmaceutical industry becomes interested. So much of my support over the years has come from the pharmaceutical industry. I mentioned that we discovered the first discovery of 5-HT as a neurotransmitter in the enteric nervous system. Well, serotonergic receptors then became drug targets. And I was involved with 3 drugs, 5-HT drugs designed to treat irritable bowel syndrome. The first one was a 5-HT3 receptor antagonist that was removed from the market for side effects. This was Lotranex, then came Cisapride, was a very effective in gastroparesis, a 5-HT4 receptor agonist, but also side effects. And then let me see I've done nothing with, I won't mention the other ones, lubiprostone. I've done quite a lot of work with these. It's Amnesia is the trade name, and it's effective in constipation, predominant irritable bowel syndrome.
And that's through Sucampo?
Sucampo, yeah. Trade name Amnesia.
Okay. I only bring that up because Sucampo and SNR Foundation have been very supportive of the society.
No, it's a very good company. The block on her name, the
Sashiko
wife.
Kuno?
Yes, yes, is a wonderful person.
She's here at the meeting.
Oh, is she?
Yeah. We talked a little bit about your research program and its evolution. We started touching about teaching and education. Tell us a little bit about how physiology education has evolved in the medical curriculum and where it was when you started versus where it is now, and if you are willing to, what's your thoughts about where we're going?
Well, you and I know very well, Marty, that in the early years, animal labs were central to physiology teaching. Mm-hmm. The medical courses at Nevada and at Ohio State, we had dog labs. And, right. And at the University of Kansas, twice a week, the dog labs. And I feel very strongly that students learned very well physiology from those lab experiences, that you cannot understand fibrillation, cardiac fibrillation, unless the chest's open in the dog and you can fibrillate and you can actually, and student can do this. And what is learned there can't be, you can't treat that, you can't test that with objective type multiple choice questions. So there's, I always say, remember a story, this little nurse, she had been a nurse, she got into medical school at Nevada, she was working with 3 other big guys, and it's a cardiovascular lab, had catheters in the carotid artery, and the catheter came out of the carotid artery. So, well, these guys jumped back, they were looking for the professor. This little girl dove in there, started pinching off, started giving orders, hemostat, that sort of thing.
She was a nurse.
She had been a nurse, but she's going to be a good doctor. And so when I evaluated her, I had much more to say than what our scores were on objective tests. But anyway, the animal rights movement, and I've respected very much and appreciated very much the APS's role in supporting us against the animal rights folks, because I don't like going into detail, but it's just terrible some of the actions they did, even in Columbus.
Right.
So we had, this was the death knell, the animal rights movement was the death knell for teaching medical students and graduate students and undergraduate students physiology with the animal. Mm-hmm. Which you know and I know there was never animal abuse. These animals were anesthetized, they were handled appropriately, and so. But okay, the demise of animal laboratories in the teaching, the lecture. Mm-hmm. I've seen the evolution of the demise of the lecture. I tell the medical students the big thing that happened at the University of Kansas was when we got fluorescent chalk and UV lights above, so you could write on the chalkboard in color. Right. So this then evolved to PowerPoint and slide presentations rather than writing on the chalkboard. Now at Ohio State, this has now evolved to the computers, and I've dictated all of my lectures onto iPod chips, and so students sit and watch my lectures on the computer. I'm not so sure this has been, I don't talk to many people around the country about their experiences. Some of the medical schools have gone in that direction with making slide presentations incorporated into computers. At Ohio State, for a couple of 3 years, they evaluate the new curriculum, and some of the older, the word gets around, and usually the evaluations come back with old Dr. Wood. One of the things they enjoyed were the stories, and you lose all of that with the face-to-face interactions with the medical students. And I have to say I've missed that at Ohio State recently, because I want to know, I want to be acquainted with
interact with the students.
Absolutely.
You've had a long history interacting or working in China and bringing Chinese scientists into the United States to work in your laboratories. How'd that relationship develop?
Well, that relationship developed when the Tiananmen Square incident, and the old professor, the first professor, our first President Bush, granted amnesty to several Chinese. And one of the individuals that was brought, 2 individuals, husband and wife, he was a general surgeon at Peking Union Hospital, and she was a very accomplished musician. She still plays the harp in the Columbus Symphony Orchestra. And they had somehow gone to University of California, San Diego, and what was his name? I'm blocking on his name. He called me and said, "Jack, I've really a nice guy. Is there anything you could do for him?" And since this was, I'll think of his name. But anyway, I said, well, bring him to Columbus. And so he did a PhD, came and did a PhD with me, and then we had to make a decision, what was he going to do? He'd been a general surgeon, so we decided anesthesiology. So he did fellowship, he did residency, and he's now still at Ohio State as an anesthesiologist, but also doing the research. So his father was a university professor our university president, in fact, outside of Shanghai. So he and I, with the drug company connections, began traveling, were invited to China to do lectures in those days on irritable bowel syndrome and cystic pride. So Ewing knew his way around China, and so we went from university to university. So I became very well acquainted with China, and very well acquainted with the transition in China. Mm-hmm. Westerners, I think, are just now coming to realize what a transition it's been from the days that I was visiting there when the young people all wore gray uniforms. They never showed any affection for one another, never mm-hmm. held hands, and the transition to now. But I've had several, especially gastroenterologists from Peking Union Hospital, that come and spend 2 or 3 years at Ohio State and then return.
You mentioned the DC-9, you mentioned, DC-9, right?
DC-8, it was a prop plane, yeah.
And you mentioned Atlantic City. Clearly, the experimental biology meeting is the outgrowth of the old FACIT meeting. Yep. Boston is a lot different than Atlantic City. Tell us a little bit about what those early meetings were like for you, and perhaps how they contrast with the meeting today.
Well, you know, the early meetings were there's not that large a contrast, because the idea of in the earlier days there weren't so many posters, wasn't an accepted mode of transmission, but very much a good distribution of research mm-hmm. Here at EB 15 and certainly at the old Federation meetings. A lot of good science, and walking around, in fact, reminds me a bit of the old Federation meeting. And for my career, one of the distractions was the growth of the American Gastroenterological Association, and because I do GI research, that became, and with the influx of gambling and casinos in Atlantic City, and no longer having the old Federation meeting, many of us gravitated to the DDW, Digestive Diseases Week. Last 2 or 3 years, I've found better science and more science that interested me, and especially the exhibits, an opportunity to see what's new in terms of instrumentation and so forth. I'm going to be coming back to the experimental biology meetings.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. I know the evolution not only of DDW, Gastroenterological Association, but a lot of the clinically based societies over the 30 years that I've been here at APS have increased the composition of basic science in those meetings, which has been detrimental to this overall meeting because people think, well, the reviewers of my research grants are going to be more clinically oriented, and so I have to go to that meeting. So, you've had some roles in APS, but you've had other roles in other societies. Tell us about your experiences working within the societies and why it's both beneficial and satisfying.
Well, first of all, it's with the APS, it was colleagues, and you developed many friends that otherwise you wouldn't have had. And the committee work, I'm trying to remember, finance committee, some of the individuals on the finance committee, I guess on publications. You were an editor, weren't you? I was an editor, yeah. And all of those were rewarding experiences, and I still, walking around, still see it. There's a few of those people still around, like myself, that just refuse to think about retirement.
You've mentored a lot of young people. We have another generation out there who are contemplating what their careers are going to look like and what they may do. What advice would you give to young scientists trying to make a decision on what direction to go with their career?
Well, to look for leading edge research, to get write their dissertations and work in laboratories that's leading edge, that they themselves are in consults with whoever they can consult with. Look for research that looks like it's at the leading edge, erythroids, biomedical tissue engineering, those sorts of things. And then, secondly, not necessarily believe that you're going to be in one of the major research universities, Johns Hopkins, Columbia University, WashU, but think about maybe smaller institutions.
The nice thing at a lot of the small schools is there are hard money salaries, and as opposed to being in an institution where you have to contribute 50% or more of your salary from a research grant.
Right.
We've talked a lot about your career and your experiences, and the last question I had on my list was to ask you about advice for young people. But are there things that we missed that you think would be appropriate to share with the audience?
Oh, I think we've done a pretty good job of covering the bases. But what I would, my suggestion, what I hope, is that the APS continues along the same trajectory it's on, and has been on since the demise of the old Federation meetings. I think that's, well, and some leadership came from my old alumnus, Illini alumnus friend.
I'll be leaving someday, just like you'll be retiring today. Let me take this moment in time then to say thank you, Jackie, for agreeing to be interviewed for the Living History program. While you and I know each other and I know some of your history, there are others who hopefully will be watching this video, learn about your career, and maybe get some lessons for themselves as they go forward. I know one of the fun things that I always have with these videos is hearing the names that are mentioned that our senior physiologists have worked with. And so there are some names that you threw out there, and hopefully the listeners will dig into it and find out who they really were. So,
well, Marty, it's been my pleasure. I'm glad that I think this is a wonderful program from the APS.
Great. Thank you very much, Jack.
You're welcome.